Matt Dillahunty, Josh Cohen, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for asking. Staying safe out there?
Staying at home. Yeah, it's as safe as home is. I hear more accidents happen in the home, so maybe I'm not as safe here. I don't know.
Well, at least we're doing our best, right? Well, hey, wanted to thank you for taking the time for me today. We'll just jump right into it if that's okay.
Sure.
Awesome, man. So, excuse me. I generally like to start, Matt, with a sort of a general, random, out-of-context question that I just find interesting, right? I know a couple years back you debated that influential psychologist Jordan Peterson on religion. Debate/discussion, whatever term you want to use, right?
We sat on talked.
Yes, exactly. I think I'd like to kick us off just by asking how that opportunity came about, Matt, and how do you think it went?
It was so I was doing a tour of Canada with my Magic and Skepticism show, and about a year prior, I had been in Vancouver at the Chan Center doing an event, and I was in the 700 person room, and there was a dressing room two down from me that just said Jordan Peterson, and everybody was like, "Oh my gosh, look who's here!" And I'm like, "Who's that?" And so he was going to talk like in the smaller room off to the side, and it was just around the time that he'd started to gain some popularity because of his opposition to to legislation in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because of that, the guy that was doing this promotional tour reached out to them, booked this, and said, "Hey, let's sit down in Toronto, and when Matt's coming through there." So instead of doing the Magic and Skepticism show, we sat down, we did that talk. We actually went to dinner beforehand, and then did the talk, and then haven't heard from him since. How do I think it went? I think I exposed some very serious problems with a number of his thoughts, but it was still largely a pleasant conversation, and he agreed at the end of it that he would like to do more of it, but I believe he was talked out of it by his representatives.
Ah, damn, that would have been fun to see. No, thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. Now, obviously, you're a well-known atheist, spokesperson, commentator, debater, speaker. I'd be anxious to know, Matt, how do you think you would describe yourself?
How can this be the hardest question to answer? Please tell me how you describe yourself. I don't know. It kind of depends on what I'm being asked, but by and large, I am a former Christian,
Mm-hmm.
Current atheist, and an activist, debater, educator, geek, and magician. Done.
Beautiful. Hey, how's that for concise, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what the specific focus is, because it could all be accurate. But I mean, like I've said before, skepticism and humanism are the two most important things to me. My atheism is third, despite that I do almost everything I do has atheist in the label. That's because it's just where I'm focused. But at the end of the day, if someone can demonstrate a God exists and it's consistent with principles of skepticism to believe it, I'll believe it. And also, if that God exists and it turns out that God isn't a humanist, then I don't want anything to do with him. Or they're going to have to come with a really good argument for why there's something wrong with being a humanist.
Which ultimately would be impossible. I should probably state for our audience, I'm with Matt Dillahunty on this side of the aisle. I would describe myself as anti-theist. I have some time set aside later on in the interview to kind of discuss that, but I should probably be clear to our audience kind of where I'm coming from on it. So I would agree with you, Matt. Now, I know you were raised, and you'll, of course, correct me if I'm wrong, Southern Baptist, and you were studying to be a minister, incredibly. In the course of studying... Oh, I'm sorry, what?
No, it's perfectly credible that I would have been studying to be a minister. Yeah, go ahead with the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd like to take that opportunity to ask. In the course of study was when you basically, I'll use the phrase, became an atheist. What was it that informed your conclusion to atheism?
Well, it's not so much a conclusion to atheism as that my previous position, the conclusion I'd previously reached, turned out to be untenable. And so, if I'm no longer convinced that Christianity is true, then it becomes a search for, okay, which religion might be true. And that is something that could take multiple lifetimes. I often joke that I studied Buddhism first to find out if I would have multiple lifetimes to answer the question. But that's just a joke. The truth is, I immediately recognized that, okay, I don't have good reason to believe this, but what kind of God might I have good reason to believe in? And so I just stepped away from every specific religious claim and started looking into philosophy to figure out what kind of claims might be worth pursuing, or which ones are more probable to pursue. And what I found is that there's really no good reason. When it comes to something like the supernatural, we're talking about unfalsifiable claims, and therefore there can never be an evidential substance or sufficient evidence to warrant belief in that proposition, given the current state of affairs. The second the supernatural becomes something that is actually believable, it will be rolled in as a part of science. And I had a debate just a couple weeks ago with Dr. Harold Resnick, who is a Hindu, and was arguing on behalf of spiritual science and supernatural science as if they were on the same footing with science. And I'm just like, that's not science. And the fact is, he kept coming up with these propositions that weren't testable, they weren't falsifiable. And I kept repeatedly asking the same question over and over again about how can one tell whether your divine revelation is true and this other person's divine revelation is not true? How can we tell? And of course, you can't. And he can't defend that. And so I'm like, that's not what epistemology is. Epistemology is the study of how do we know what we know. So when I was going through this, it wasn't so much that I became convinced of atheism. My atheism at its base level is just, I am not convinced that a God exists. I may also be convinced that specific gods don't exist, or that perhaps, I think I am convinced that no gods do in fact exist, only to the extent that every proposed God has failed to meet its burden of proof, and any God that exists either hasn't even made an attempt yet to interact with us.
Right.
And so it was really pretty straightforward of how I ended up going from sincere fundamentalist Christian studying with the hope of becoming, a minister, to, wow, I can't believe that. What else can I not, believe? What other views do I have that I just went along with? I even had to sit there and go, is there a good reason to be opposed to murder? Because if my previous reason was thou shalt not kill, what's my new reason going to be? And it turns out there's plenty of good reasons to be opposed to murder. There's a reason why it's illegal. There's a reason why whether or not it's illegal isn't contingent on which religion is in power.
Right.
And so some questions are easier than others. But yeah, that's how I got kind of from there to here-ish.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, there's a reason that if we see someone being attacked in the street, even if you don't believe in a God, something tells you what you ought to be doing about that, right? We get a morality in the secular world. Excuse me, not from the divine. Sorry, I had a frog in my throat. There must have been God force choking me or something. One of my favorite... One of my favorite arguments when I'm discussing or debating religion with people, my father included, he's a very devout, Christian, is when they say, I just don't have the faith to be an atheist. I know you've heard this before. It's a trope repeated by Lee Strobel, by William Lane Craig, by Frank Turek, by many others. I dedicate this question to my father, Walter. Matt Dillahunty, why is atheism not a faith position?
Because you'd have to have a positive belief in order to say that it is justified by faith. First of all, we'd have to define faith. Now, I have a particular definition of faith, which is faith is the excuse people give for believing something when they don't have a good reason. Because if I say, why do you believe this? And you have a good reason, you give me the good reason. And if I say, why do you believe this? And you don't have a good reason, then you say it's a tentative faith. Now, what your dad and others probably mean most often is that it is an exercise of faith, and in this sense, it is confidence in the absence of certainty. The problem is that can only apply to a positive position. So if I were to say, I believe there are no gods, that position may be justified by evidence, or it might be justified by an appeal to faith. In my case, I think it's justified by evidence and argument. However, My atheism is just, I'm not convinced that your God exists, and that's not a faith-based position. I'm not even saying you're wrong. I'm saying you have failed to demonstrate that you're right. And what's worse is that you and everybody else who believes and has believed and has made every attempt to demonstrate the truth of this proposition for thousands of years has also failed to meet their burden of proof. And that goes a long way. The argument from divine hiddenness, the notion that the world does not look the way we would expect it to look if in fact there was a God that was interacting with people, and it looks more like if a God either didn't exist or a God is intentionally hiding. Those two scenarios are far more consistent with reality than any proposed God. And so my position is not, I am convinced that you are wrong. It is, I'm not convinced that you're right, and therefore there's no faith required.
Understood. Perfect. Yeah, I interviewed someone a few years back who I know will be familiar to you, Dr. Richard Carrier, and I remember he said the same thing to me. The universe looks exactly like it would if there was no creator.
Rick's been a friend of mine for a number of years. I'm hoping to have him on my new show at some point because we'll probably talk about mythicism, which is the one thing that he and I vehemently disagree on. And when I say vehemently disagree, that's not really true, because there's at least two different camps of mythicists, and some of them are conspiracy theorist, irrational, blah blah blah. And then Rick is, at least trying to make a much more reasoned effort towards it, using Bayes theory and stuff. So Bayes theorem and other options in his model. I'm not convinced that we can get to a point where we can say, it's more reasonable to conclude that Jesus did not exist as an actual person than that he didn't. I would rather just say, I have no idea whether or not Jesus existed in history. I think it wouldn't bother me that much if it turned out that he did. And the things about his life that are most important, nobody has any good reason to believe. Nobody has any good reason to believe that he performed any miracles or raised the dead or was raised from the dead or any of that. But the notion that there's an itinerant rabbi running around in, first century Palestine, in Judea, etc. Well, that's trivial. There were bunches of those, and what we're hearing about is perhaps either an amalgamation of many of them, or a fictional one that was modeled after others, or an actual true one who lived and breathed and did the things. But when I look at the Bible, what confidence can I have that what the Bible says about what that person said and did is actually accurate? And without originals and no way to investigate it, it's laughable. And to me, this is damning. So I have friends who are mythicists and say Jesus didn't exist. I don't agree with them. But the fact that they can make a reasonable argument for this is already a problem for Christianity. Because if in fact a God exists and Jesus was divine and Jesus came down and did and said the things that he did and performed the things that he said he did, and this is all true, the fact that there isn't sufficient evidence for somebody to reach that conclusion already shows that God is an idiot. That did not anticipate that in a couple thousand years we will have methods of investigation that will be able to expose this, that we will come to an understanding of skepticism and critical thinking in such a way that we can say, hey, how do I know that what this person wrote down a couple thousand years ago, for which I don't have an original copy, it's copies of translations of copies of oral traditions, God would have, I understand this. Why on earth would it be so difficult for God to reveal himself at a time when there's a possibility of investigating it? And if he's willing to come down and reveal himself in the first century, why can't he do it now? Why is a Damascus Road experience good enough for Saul, but the rest of us have to rely on Saul's supposed account?
Well, because the Lord works in mysterious ways.
And the mysterious ways that he works in looks exactly the same as if there was nobody there doing any work at all.
So one of the stupidest things we as human beings do, I think, is we look for patterns. And, Hitchens has made this point often that even a conspiracy theory to us as evolved primates, right? Even a conspiracy theory is often better than no theory at all. The mind searches for form.
Yeah, that's not so much about our pattern seeking. By the way, our pattern seeking is a really good thing. It's when we, the frustration or the problem where it becomes a problem is when we are unwilling to accept I don't know as an answer, and then we go looking for whatever pattern we can match to it. That's different. And so there's like type 1 mistakes and type 2 mistakes, where one is false positives and 2 are false negatives, or vice versa. I always forget which one. Somebody will email in and say, Matt got that exactly backwards. The point is there are 2 of them, and I'm not going to call them 1 and 2. Type positive fallacies are when you have a false positive, and type negative fallacies are when you have a false negative. There you go.
Voila. Obviously, I can't have Matt Dillahunty on and not discuss the Atheist Experience. That would be a sin. Excuse me. I actually had the pleasure a few years back, Matt, of calling in to Talk Heathen. I spoke with Eric and Jamie for about 10, 15 minutes, which was great fun. Yeah, I'd love to know, how is it that you exactly came to be involved with the Atheist Experience?
I was working for a software company. I had kind of started to find my way out of religion after 9/11, but it took a while, and there was a lot of thought and study, and then I was working for a company, and I was doing a lot of writing online for various online magazines, specifically about religion. There was actually a website called, oh, am I even going to remember the name?
Iron Chariots? No,
that was mine. There was just like an online magazine, and anybody could write and submit something, and there were a list of editors. It was basically a way of exploiting the people who were sitting around wanting to vent and turning them basically into the authors for an online news magazine where none of us were paid, and yet they make money advertising our stuff. But there was a guy there who wrote under the pseudonym Skip to Malou, who would post a sermon. He'd pick out a passage and he'd post a sermon. And I not every time, but most of the times when he would post a sermon, I would take the exact same passage and I would essentially write a counter sermon talking about the various different ways that one could interpret this passage, and also the ways in which other religious people have, in fact, interpreted that passage. And, it was interesting. And somebody at work said, oh, wow, have you seen this show, The Atheist Experience? Because I think you'd love it. And I was like, what is it? And they said, oh, it's a call-in show where they argue about religion. And I was like, I don't know that I would want to watch a show with a bunch of people I agree with. It's like, what am I going to get out of that? And they're like, oh, I don't know, maybe you should check it out. And I ignored it. But by coincidence, Jeff D., who was one of the former hosts, happened to live in the same apartment complex that I lived in.
No.
I put a flyer up on the mailbox, and I went out on Sunday at about 2 or 3 in the afternoon to check the mail, grabbed my mail, saw the flyer, and noticed, hey, that show's getting ready to start in like an hour and a half. I'll just go in and watch it. And that was December of 2004, I believe. And I went inside and watched, and I called in and talked to them. And then I went to the after show dinner. And the following week I was there in the studio screening phone calls and working on the lower third graphics. And I worked behind the scenes for a few months. And then in March, Jeff D was supposed to do an episode with Ashley, and he didn't show up. And Ashley said, I'd just written an article about the Supreme Court's decision on the 10 Commandments monuments. Mm-hmm. And Ashley just looked at me and said, hey, you want to just go on the air and do the show? And I said, yep. And the rest is history. It was shortly after that I became a regular, and then I became the host, and then I became the president, and then I became not the president, and then I became the president again, and now I'm not the president again. So it's been an interesting ride, but I love doing it. That's a banging guy.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, hang on one sec. The complex where we have our studio has a really weird pipe thing where there's a banging. So if that happens, I apologize for that. That's on our end.
because I've got earbuds in, when I heard it, I was like, is that coming from them? Or is there someone downstairs like banging on something in my house and I'm hearing it through here?
We have a guy tied up in the basement. He's trying to get out.
It's probably Jesus.
Let me see. No, brilliant. You know what? No, we'll lead it in this way. How do you feel about the term evangelical atheism?
I suppose it's not wholly inaccurate, and I've said before that I don't that the label fits me. Because my mom, God told my mom I was going to be a preacher, and well, she thinks she's right. It's just that I'm preaching for Satan, from her perspective. And I would say that I am, in fact, a preacher of sorts, and that I am, in fact, evangelical of sorts. But if anything, I am more of an apologist for skepticism and humanism, and atheism becomes kind of like an ancillary result of that, because I'm an atheist because I'm a skeptic. And because when I evaluate the claims of religions under the guise of skepticism, they do not meet, they do not provide sufficient evidence for belief. That's it. I'll change my mind on a God the second there's evidence. I don't see how it could be possible for me to change my mind on humanism. So.
Right. Understood. I get much the same thing. I do actually debates myself in the Minneapolis area on atheism, on the atheist side, I mean to say. And I'm always accused of being militant and evangelical, and I always say, well, I'm no more militant, no more evangelical than my opponent. I'm just on the other side. What's wrong with that?
It's weird because militant takes on another. So first of all, evangelical atheist, okay, I'll own it. Militant atheist, I won't. And it's because this notion of militancy
sort of an
suggests that I
anti-theocracy.
Forcibly remove people's religion.
Right.
And I would never support legislation that would deprive someone of the right to believe as their conscience dictates, and the right to act and worship as their conscience dictates. The only time I'm in agreement with Madison that the only time the government should have anything to say about religion is when one person's religious views come in conflict with another's. Outside of that, go do the things that you want to do. But it's only when your religion starts to encroach on other people's rights that we have any legitimate kind of say in that.
Right.
And so if there was legislation that said we're going to make it illegal to hold this religious belief, I would stand in opposition to it. On the other hand, there are some facets of some religions that I think should be illegal. Like I'm opposed to routine infant circumcision. I think that should be illegal. It's a violation of the bodily autonomy of the individual. There's no reason not to wait. Same thing with female genital mutilation. The same thing with forced or compliant wearing of hijab and other things like that. I don't know how you get to a point where you can say I am truly wearing this of my own volition, as long as there are consequences to not doing it. And so I think there's an onus to step in and protect. But by and large, if your religion requires you to pray 20 times a day and to not eat mushrooms or to eat only special mushrooms, I generally don't care, as long as you are not impacting or jeopardizing somebody else's rights, health, or happiness. Well, happiness we may have to exclude, because if somebody's there's plenty of people who are unhappy that I am an atheist and speaking out. As a matter of fact, I'm currently in an argument with a Muslim imam with over 1 million followers on Facebook, who wrote an article about the beheading that took place in France just the other day. And while he denounces it, he does that in like a sentence or two. And the rest of it is a whole bunch of whataboutism and reminders that, looking at this random act is not stemming from a classical ruling on blasphemy. Such provocations against our religion and prophet have happened constantly. Rarely have they met with such violence. This act needs to be understood in the broader socio-political framework of French Muslims versus the French establishment. The visceral anger and rage that causes, and it keeps going and going and going. And I'm like, I wrote, my post was very clear. Someone murdered someone for offending them, period. You can find out all sorts of nuance and encouragement to see it from many sides. But at the end of the day, someone brutally slaughtered someone because they were offended on behalf of their religion. And there's a whole lot more that I wrote there. But the replies, which now my response has almost as many replies as his entire article. And it's a whole bunch of name calling and whataboutism, oh, murder's wrong. Why are you here objecting to this murder when the state of Texas has killed so many people? I'm like, it's literally whataboutism. What about this? What about this? What about this? And it's like 16,000 a year on average and 300 deaths a year. And I'm like, did I say I was in favor? You know nothing about me other than I objected to this killing and objected to making softballing this thing, because this isn't the first time. This started today because a Muslim author in London, a guy by the name of Roshan Salih, who writes for like a 5 Pillars site, tweeted out today that Charlie Hebdo must be shut down immediately by French authorities. This racist Islamophobic rag is causing communities' relations to completely break down with its repeated provocations. They are literally crying fire in a crowded theater. Freedom of speech isn't worth a civil war. Now, set aside the fact that he used literally wrong, which already pisses me off.
Yeah.
Set aside the fact that I actually do think freedom of speech is not only worth a civil war, I think it's worth a revolution, and I think it's the reason, one of the key reasons why we have the country that I live in. But it's really disgusting to me that he doesn't understand the value of free speech that he's exercising at the moment. Because what he's saying is murder is a viable method for shutting down contentious speech, and he should be running around thrilled that no one is killing him for suggesting that killing people to silence them is a good course of action. The irony of not recognizing that is baffling to me, and this is my daily life.
No, it's absolutely disgraceful. I'm a free speech absolutist myself. I can't help but notice that the religions that claim themselves as the most tolerant and the most understanding and etc. seem to be the ones where all the violence comes from. On the idea of the Prophet Muhammad, I think that ideology is so ridiculous you can even publish a cartoon about it, or you can blaspheme it to, air quotes here, in a novel. Nothing's above satire.
Yeah, no, I there's no sacred cows with that, but it's really strange because literally 5 days ago, I was threatened in an email by a Muslim with physical violence. Now, there are a handful of individuals. Some are Muslims, some are Catholics, some are of religions that I'm not completely clear about, but they are of some Christian religion, who have been attacking people in the atheist community. And because of that, I've been contacted by the FBI regard to some things. And so this individual sent me an email that just said, "Matt, you're a coward. If I see you, I will break your nose." Now, this was because he had emailed us. He had called into the show when Jenna and I were on. We talked a little bit about his beliefs. He was not happy with the way it went. Tried to send a personal message to Jenna suggesting that, Jenna, you have offended our holy book. That is not nice of you. The Quran to us is more valuable than our lives. I would like to invite you to read this important book. And he links a book on Amazon. And then he said, education is important, so read it if you still have 1% sincerity in you. Now, first of all, Jenna is one of the most sincere people on the planet. So questioning her sincerity is beyond disgusting. But he also says, our greeting is peace, but you don't deserve it. And when I called him out for this, by the way, this is a Muslim living in the Netherlands. When I called him out for this and told him, when you write someone to tell them that they offended a book, you look really pathetic, because a book cannot feel offended. The truth is you were offended, and next time you should just own that. But, and I don't know what language you do or don't want in here, but I will read the portion and you can bleep it on out.
Have at it.
I don't care if you're offended. Fuck Islam, fuck the Quran, fuck Muhammad, fuck Allah, and fuck you for prioritizing your offense and for being snarky and suggesting that you have any grounds to lecture any of us about education or sincerity. But when you say you are about peace and immediately followed up that we don't deserve peace, you've lost. This was the email that he responded with, "I'm going to break your nose." And I sent him back a rather lengthy, detailed back and forth. And he was like, fuck you and the FBI, and your nose can be fixed, but eternal hellfire can't. And the email that I sent back at the end was this. I'm not going to read the whole email that I sent back to him, but I basically sent back something that said, look, I don't need to read your book. You've already determined that you're not a thinker, that you're someone who just threatens. You're someone who deserves pity. You're afraid of a fictional hell, and you're threatening me with it. You're making excuses for a deity that you can't demonstrate, and then you threaten violence. I don't think I have anything to learn from you. And here's the problem. I've met Muslims who, unlike you, don't threaten violence and actually do work towards peace. So I won't judge all of Islam based on your direct threat at me. But you should know that others probably will. And they'll just use your threats as a way of saying, look, They claim to be a religion of peace, but they'll threaten violence after a single email response that they don't like. I've never threatened violence against anybody, or at least I don't recall. I won't say never, because it's possible that I've threatened to kick somebody's ass at some point, in the heat of the moment. But never in any sort of intellectual interaction have I gone to the I'll mess you up. That's just not real. And so I said, if your religion is truly peaceful, then you're a shitty example for it.
Yes.
But I think the truth is that your religion is not about peace, and neither are you. You just want to act like you are, and you want to act like you're one of the good guys when you're really just terrified child forced into constant prayer and servility, and it shows when you threaten me with physical violence. You're the reason Sam Harris has to travel with armed guards. You're the reason Salman Rushdie lives in exile. You're the reason, or lived in exile. You're the reason people fear and despise Muslims. You're the reason event organizers have to pay more money for insurance when atheists like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Sarah Haider and Mariam Namazi and Faisal Saeed al-Mattar and other ex-Muslims speak. And by the way, those aren't just my friends, because I don't really care for Ayaan Hirsi Ali much at all. But, yeah, I work with them. Your religion is vile. Your fear isn't your own fault. That's something they did to you. Your parents and your imams and the Muslims who surrounded you reinforced delusions of fears. But the good news is you don't have to live this way. You don't have to live in fear. You don't have to hold views that you can't defend with reason. You don't have to threaten people with physical violence. You can do and be better. And if you want to do that, I'm open to having a conversation. And if you don't bother emailing me again, because I'll just forward it to the authorities. And I have never heard from him again.
Damn. I love it. Thanks, Matt. I'd like to bring it back slightly to the Atheist Experience. The reason I wanted to ask earlier about the idea of the evangelical atheist, a term, by the way, I actually like. I think it's actually ironic and a little funny.
I have a big problem with it,
Yeah. Let me see. My dad wanted me to ask you, on the topic of evangelical atheism, why do you think an atheist call-in show is so important? What merits the existence of it? You have my father Walter to thank for that one.
What merits the existence of a show that takes calls to have conversations with people who are cocksure that they're right and yet never able to demonstrate it, when the overwhelming majority of people in my country and around the world share their views and vote and enact legislation on the rest of us based on those views? Why on earth would anybody? Here's a better question. Why do we need 500 million fucking preachers on TV? And if that's the case, if we have multiple networks dedicated to one religion and additional networks dedicated to another, and I have one show that I do Sundays from 4:30 to 6 where I take calls and actually interact with the people who disagree with me, which is the exact opposite of every other show, and yet you're going to ask me what justification do I have for my show? Get fucked. Sorry to talk to your dad that way, but it's absolutely ridiculous, because we have all of this religion, we're soaking in it.
Yeah.
It's never challenged, and we put up a show that says, call in and tell us why you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us what you believe and why you think we should believe it. And I've been hosting it for 15 years. And to date, we don't have, and not that this is surprising, 15 years is a drop in the bucket, considering the thousands of years that we've had these conversations. We have zero evidence that any religion is true or good, or that it's beneficial. By the way, the United States is not a Christian nation.
No, it's not.
Secular, with a secular constitution. And yet we are flooded with religion, and yet we put up an atheist show saying, hey, come tell us why you're right. And they keep failing, and yet people are asking, essentially, what right do I have to put on a show? I tell you what, it's essential. I'm working my ass off to counter 10 pounds of bullshit in a 5-pound bag that is the United States, and yet somehow, what reason would you have to put on a show like this? I don't know. That reminds me of a Bill Hicks bit where he's sitting in a Waffle House. He's reading a book, and the waitress comes up and says, "What are you reading for?" And he's like, "Not what are you reading, but what are you reading for?" And he's like, "I think I'm reading so I don't become a Waffle House waitress."
I like
Not
that.
There's anything wrong with a Waffle House waitress, but that joke reminds me of the same thing, because why are you standing up in opposition to all of this religiosity? Does it demonstrate that it's true? Mm-hmm. And I have to live under the regime that it imparts upon people? When they vote and it determines who I can marry, who I can't marry, what I can do with my own body, what I can say, what I can do. It is essential, and there should be more shows like this. But I got pretty good job security.
Voila. Well, take that, Dad. Let me see. Obviously, you've been on the show, Matt, for many years thus far. I'm curious, do you have a favorite or most memorable call-in that happened? One that springs to mind for you?
No, and I honestly, so I stream live on Twitch quite frequently. And one of the things that happens is people show up and they'll start asking me questions. And one of the most common questions that people ask is, what's your favorite X? And it doesn't matter if they're asking me about games or whatever. It's very difficult. I don't necessarily know that I have too many favorites, and it can change day to day. I don't have a favorite band. Somebody could say like, hey, is Pink Floyd your favorite band? And I'd be like, yeah. And then say, yeah, but isn't Yes your favorite band? And I'd be like, yeah. Well, isn't Rush your favorite band? Yes. Isn't Eminem your favorite? Yes. It just depends on what mood I'm in. And so when it comes to the calls, quite frankly, there are calls, you could probably pull up a clip and say, do you remember this call? And the answer is going to be no 99% of the time. There was one call where somebody talked about what wakes you up in the morning and I think we talked about an alarm clock, and that they were convinced that God woke them up in the morning, and that if they ever became convinced that there wasn't a God to wake them up in the morning, they would not have the will to continue living. And I respond to that talking about how absolutely saddening that was, that you feel that the entirety of life, everything there is to learn, to explore, to enjoy, would not be worth pursuing if it weren't also true that there was a God who made sure they got up in the morning. It reminds me, I think I'm going to forget who the quote's from, and I'll just butcher it. It's like looking at a beautiful flower and saying, that flower is gorgeous, but if it wasn't made by a God specifically to be gorgeous, that's not enough for me. And it's just strange to me. It's like the pinnacle of arrogance and self-importance, that here is all of this reality to explore and discover and appreciate. And if you look at something and you're like, oh, I think this was all created with me in mind, right, by the founder of the universe. And if I find out that that's not true, it's no longer beautiful. It's no longer worth my time. I can't think in terms like that.
Nihilistic and solipsistic. Do you ever, question just kind of actually occurred to me, Matt. I'd love to get your thoughts on. Do you ever get nervous when you go live on the Atheist? Don't get nervous?
I don't get nervous anywhere anymore. Early on, when I first took over as president of the ACA, and I was not. So the biggest reason that I didn't want to become a preacher when I was a teenager, even though that's what I thought and my parents thought and my church thought God wanted me to do, is I was terrified of public speaking. I had done magic. I'd been a magician since I was a kid. I would get nervous performing. And when I first gave a press release on the steps of the Capitol for the Atheist Community of Austin talking about a legal ruling, I was a nervous wreck. And there were only like a handful of 20 people and a few photographers. That was it. And I was nervous. Then I started actually talking, and I gave a number of lectures to the ACA, and I gave more and more lectures. And eventually I got to the point where the only time I was nervous is if I was doing a magic show and I was debuting a new effect. Because if it's something that I've done for 40 years, there's nothing to be nervous about. And if you've practiced and prepared, and then there's nothing to be nervous about there. So I went from being nervous every time I was speaking to only being nervous in this one little situation, if I'm doing a magic show and if it is a new effect. Then it got to the point where that didn't bother me anymore because I had a good understanding and I studied and I prepped and I knew what to do if something went wrong. And so now I just don't get nervous at all anymore. And it turns out for anybody who's afraid of public speaking, I can't say what your specific issue is, but for me, it was really simple. If you go out there with the understanding that there are going to be people who like you and people who don't, and that you may or may not change anybody's mind, and that if you just go out as yourself, talk about what you know, don't pretend to know things that you don't know, there's absolutely nothing to be scared of, because anybody who's going to, if you're willing to acknowledge, oh, wow, I was wrong. I made a mistake there. This is not the way things. If that's the case, what is there to be afraid of? The fact that, somebody was going to say, oh, Matt's fat. Well, yeah, congratulations, I am. I used to be way fatter. And there were people who'd call the show and they'd be like, you're bald and fat. And I'm like, don't tell me something I don't know. I really shaved my head right before we came on here, and you're calling to call me bald. I mean, I grew this body after 8 years in the Navy all the way up to 270 pounds. I'm back down around 200 now, but I was up around 270. And it's like, you're going to call and tell me I'm fat like I didn't know that? And the follow-up is, yes, I am, but what does that have to do with whether or not Jesus is real?
Right.
And that's when you'd get the callers that were like, I'm going to come down there and punch you in your fat face for Jesus, and I'm whatever.
That was it. That was the quote. I was trying to think about what it was. Yeah, punching your fat face for Jesus.
Yeah. It's one. But yeah, there's nothing to be afraid of as long as you're just being yourself and understand that, you're not going to appeal to everybody.
No, brilliant. No, thanks, Matt. I appreciate that.
My favorite person on the show most of the time, and I like me.
Let's see. Back in 2011, Matt, if my information is correct here, you had the pleasure of being awarded the Atheist of the Year award, the Hitchy, apparently, as it was called, by Stax Roche Writing for Examiner.com. Do I have that correct?
Probably. That's not like a real that award or that. That's just some dude that was looking for attention for his website who created an award.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you what that experience was like.
It was annoying. I have nothing to do with the individual anymore. It was basically that there's a lot of people who it's like, and actually this just happened. There was a convention in the UK where they called me to say, you've been nominated for this award. We'd like for you to share this and get your fans to come vote on this. And I was like, first of all, I'm not interested in popularity contests. Second of all, you're not fooling anybody. You want people to promote your conference. And so you found a way to do it, which is we're going to have a big vote on who's the Atheist of the Year, as if I give a crap.
Right.
And they're like, no, somebody else nominated you. And, you could actually win this. And I'm like, I do not want to be considered. Because also the organizers of this conference had said and done some terrible things, and I didn't want to be associated with them in the first place. So I've received 2 awards that I know of, which I am actually proud of in the entire time I've been involved in the movement. One of them isn't even an award. It was just a plaque noting that I was president of the Atheist Community of Austin from 2006 through 2013. So basically 7 years. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I was for the last year and a half until a couple weeks ago again. But that plaque meant something because I was the first president of the ACA, even though the group had existed prior. And I worked really hard to make sure that the group grew and that it was, a proper community. Some other people came along afterwards and made some additional changes. Many of them were great improvements. A couple of them weren't. The only other award that I've ever received came from the Freethinkers Association of Central Texas. And it's a proper plaque. It is the Katherine Farringer Award. Katherine was a contemporary of Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who both of them, Madalyn was in Austin, Katherine was in San Antonio, and they were using public access to reach people. Madalyn, of course, became the most hated woman in America. And I have some of my friends were friends with Madalyn, and I really I regret the fact that she and I never got to meet or have a conversation. But she was dead before I was even an atheist. But the people who know us both say that we would have gotten along really well, and we would have fought like cats and dogs on occasion. Katherine Farringer was a completely different person. She was just a humanist and skeptic sitting on public access, having those conversations and promoting free thought. I am the first and I think only recipient of the Katherine Farringer Award from Free Thinkers Association of Central Texas. And I'm proud of the award because it's specifically in recognition of what I've done with the Atheist Experience. It's for accomplishments in media, I guess.
Sure.
And I'm proud of it. And even if they only made up the word that day to give to me and they never give it to anybody else, I'm proud of that one. Unlike, that thing with Stacks is not worth getting into.
Fair enough. No, that's interesting, Matt. I appreciate that. I'd love to move on to the people that have inspired your, let's be slightly euphemistic for a moment and call it perhaps atheist philosophy, right? I had the incredible honor of interviewing Christopher Hitchens' brother, Peter Hitchens, on the podcast a few years back, which was a lot of fun. Hitchens has been one of my own personal, great inspirations. The Portable Atheist, which he edited, and of course, God Is Not Great, are mainstays for me. Excuse me. I'm curious, who among the atheist philosophers or the new atheist movement have inspired you, if any?
It's kind of weird because, so first of all, I reject the whole notion of new atheism, but
yes.
I at least understand what you and other people are talking about when you use the term, and plenty of people use the term even if they're not happy with it. So cool. I've been fortunate to share the stage and have conversations with a couple of the Four Horsemen, Sam and Richard in particular. I've traded emails with Dan Dennett. We haven't done anything together. Dan's probably the person in the atheist movement who I admire most and would most want to have a conversation with, and yet haven't. While I'm certainly a fan of what most of them are doing, I was more like I was already involved in this before Sam kind of blew up. Like I remember hosting the Atheist Experience, and we aired The God Who Wasn't There, which is a documentary by Brian Fleming, I believe, which touches a little on mythicism. It features Richard Carrier. It features Sam Harris, and specifically talking about his book, The End of Faith. And so while his book was out and had been popular, the atheist movement was still kind of in its new infancy or kicking off in popularity. And so, I like Sam. I disagree with Sam on some things. I like Richard. I disagree with Richard on some things. It's the people who inspired me the most were like David Hume and Voltaire and Colonel Ingersoll. To find out that the world was very different at the end of the 19th century when Colonel Ingersoll, the great agnostic, was speaking at the Republican Party convention and debating ministers in town squares and in newspapers. And then to have us take a monumental step backwards, particularly in 1954, 55, and 56, when the McCarthy era stuff came in, and we changed the Pledge of Allegiance, and we added one nation under God to all of our money, and we continued this notion that talking about politics and religion was something that decent people didn't bother doing. And so by stopping the conversations, we basically retarded progress and made people less intelligent and less informed on matters of religion, politics, and the history of these. When people find out, like I carry around in my wallet a couple of $2 bills, including one from 1935 that does not have "In God We Trust" on it. And when I speak at universities, which is a couple times a year, I tend to pull that out and pass it around the room. I hand it out with a modern $2 bill, and I ask them. I don't tell them what's going on. I just ask them, hey, jot down some notes about the differences between these $2 bills, because there are differences. There are differences in the ink and the coloring and this, that, and everything else. And so I want to see how many differences they jot down and whether anybody notices, that it does not say "In God We Trust." And it's that kind of stuff. We lost a step with that. And while I'm, there's plenty of modern atheists who I'm fond of, I'm friends with most of them, so it's not like the, oh, I really, really, really look up to Seth Andrews. I mean, Seth is my best friend probably in the world, if not just in this movement. Maybe not in the world if we count my brother, because my brother's my best friend in the world.
Sure.
But Seth is phenomenal, and yet we're really good friends and we talk all the time. And there are others, I don't tend to have heroes anymore. The closest I've come to a modern hero is James Randi, who I'm also friendly with and have done events with and sat on stage with. We had a conversation in Vancouver. We've done a magic show, kind of a magic show together. And I greatly admire and love the man and hope that he lives to be 1,000,000. But, I also know that he's flawed and I'm flawed and Sam's flawed and Richard's flawed. All of us are flawed. And so it's a matter of, when you find the flaws in someone, are they able to have a conversation about that and potentially change? And all of us are going to be resistant to it in different ways and at different times. But the people who are most open to it, like I had an amazingly short and productive argument with Richard Dawkins at lunch one day here in Austin about abortion. I was getting ready to do a debate on abortion, and he objected. He asked me, he's like, oh, how are you going to argue this, and what's your position, what's your view? And I told him what my take on it was, and he did not like that at all. He thought I should go a completely different route. And he presented his different route, and I pointed out the flaws in his route and why I wasn't going to go that way. And I don't know that I changed his mind. He definitely didn't change mine, because he was fucking wrong. I mean, he's just wrong. And for anybody who doesn't know, personhood is irrelevant to the subject of abortion. It's all about bodily autonomy. And if you start talking about, the brain hasn't developed, and so therefore there's not a person at this particular point, none of that's relevant. Because even if it was a person, it doesn't have the right to use somebody else's body without their consent. It doesn't, your 2-year-old doesn't have a right to your kidney. And so the anti-choice group are essentially creating special rights for embryos. They're not granting embryos and fetuses the same rights as everyone else. They're granting them rights that people don't have. I don't have a right to your blood, your kidneys. I don't have a right to attach myself to you and use you as a filtering system. Anyway, that was a long way around to answer your question about who I like or admire.
No, that was interesting, man. I appreciate it. I want to get on to the subject of debate. Excuse me. How did you start your career as a debater of atheism? No, phrase it this way. How does one become a professional debater of atheism?
I have no idea. I'm not even convinced there is such a thing. Yes, I've been doing it for a number of years. Yes, I do get paid to do debates. Debates are not my primary source of income. They never have been. The Atheist Debates Project, the series of videos that I do about debating, that is, in fact, my primary source of income and has been for the past few years. I was doing a live call-in show, and some people started reaching out to me saying, hey, would you like to do a formal public debate? And I was like, yeah. And I don't have a lot of experience. I took one debating class when I was like in 8th grade, and I was really sheltered and not very, don't get me wrong, I was bright, but I was assigned to debate abortion and to debate the pro-choice side, and I was a fundamentalist Christian. And so I went back to the class and brought my parents with me, and my parents said, basically, hey, we don't want him to defend it, because if he convinces someone. When I took that debate class, I went back in, because I'd been assigned to debate abortion on the pro-choice side, and my parents basically went in and talked to my teacher and said, hey, it's against our religion, and so if he were to convince someone to do this, we weren't Catholic, so it wouldn't have been like a mortal sin or something, but it would have been, I'm responsible for something that I find to be murder and in opposition to my religion. And so the teacher suggested that instead of doing that, we debate euthanasia. And I'd never heard the term, so for me, it was youth, as in young people, in Asia. Now, I have no idea how I prepared for this debate or what I actually said, because I don't remember it. It was probably an absolute train wreck. But when somebody asked me finally, after hosting Atheist Experience for a while, hey, would you do public formal debate? I said, yeah. And what I found is that I showed up for the first debate that I ever did. The first big public debate was at UMBC in Baltimore against Father Hans Jacobsy on morality. And I prepped like a madman. I had notes for days. I had an opening statement. I had a closing statement. I had prepared responses to various things. And it was the weirdest experience of my life at that moment, because through the entire debate, he kept agreeing with me. The whole thing was, can you reach proper moral conclusions based on purely secular reasoning? And throughout the entire debate, he agreed with me every time and was like, hey, Matt seems like the kind of guy me and Matt could go out and have a beer. And of course you can get to the right answer by purely secular means. I wouldn't have suggested otherwise, blah, 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 blah. And then we get to the closing remarks after he spent the entire debate agreeing with me. And he gets to close after me. And I kid you not, go find the debate. It's like a Jekyll and Hyde moment, unlike anything you've ever seen. Because this guy who wanted to have a beer with me and who agreed with me stood up and started talking about Nazis and gulags and pornography and how secularism necessarily leads to those things. And I'm just sitting there going, I am crushed at this moment because I know I'm not going to get to respond to that. And I'm sitting here going, is this what big debates are actually about? That you can have this back and forth discussion, have someone agree with you, and because they get to go last, they get to say whatever batshittery pops into their head, and you just leave it like that? Well, luckily there was a Q&A after the closing remarks. And during the Q&A, I hope I find this person. I owe them a drink. There's a gentleman that got up and asked a question, and I don't know how they phrased it, but the question was essentially, hey, can you tell us what you thought of his closing remarks? And I was like, hooray! Now I get that's his closing because the question was asked. It was so obvious this guy got it. And then the next day there was an interview that Father Jacobsy did on an Orthodox podcast where they were talking about the debate, and the woman who was interviewing him was basically like, I was at the debate last night, and it seemed like Matt had never spent any time at all thinking about morality. You seemed to know it all and caught him off guard with every question you asked. And Father Jacobsy was like, yes, I understand that, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting here going, that is not remotely what happened. And it's, but I think they know that their audience on that podcast is not going to go listen to that debate. And if they do, they're going to go into it with the well already being poisoned, and they're going to hear anything and everything that Father Jacobsy says as if it were real and just,
right,
true. And me, I'm just the heathen. And that first debate was eye-opening for me. So the advice I give to people, if you want to get into that, know what you're getting into. And know, first of all, that debate is primarily theater. That the truths of the world are not determined by debate. Debating is this process that we go through. It is about being persuasive. It is about making a connection with the audience. I love Richard Dawkins. There are people who want to debate Richard who should debate me instead because I'm a former Southern Baptist. I'm not. Richard gets dismissed. Richard is an intellectual. He's very. I forget Oxford or Cambridge, but
Oxford.
Yeah, Oxford, and stereotypically so. Before that, he was basically Church of England, and that's like religion super light in the UK that nobody gives a shit about.
Right.
And so when he steps on stage, what I want Richard doing is I want Richard teaching and defending science. I don't want him to go up and get some creationist the time of day on morality, because quite frankly, scientists aren't necessarily good at debates. Debates are theater, and it's about making a connection. When I walk into a Southern Baptist church and talk about how I got from there to here, there's virtually nothing they can say. When I debated Michael Licona on the resurrection, former members of my church that I attended as a teenager had flown down specifically to stand up during the Q&A and say, I don't understand. We thought you were going on to great things for God. What happened? That sort of credibility can never happen with Richard. I don't begrudge him. He should be able to debate anybody he wants to. It's just that why? And he's not. I don't want to sound rude or dismissive. He can be very engaging and very entertaining. It's just that when I view him in debate, it's like he doesn't do that. It's not his thing. And so why not just have him keep educating the world on science and keep being the popularizer, and other people can do the debate.
Yeah. No, I would agree, Matt. Hate to keep bringing it back to my father, but I know I know often in debates you've used the gumball analogy, right? Just for Walter Cohen, my dad, would you mind running through the gumball analogy?
This jar contains some number of gumballs, and we're only concerned with whole gumballs. So if there's little pieces in the bottom, we'll ignore that. The number of whole gumballs in this jar is either even or odd. There are no other options. If you say to me, Matt, that jar has an even number of gumballs in it, I'm going to say, I do not believe that. How did you reach that conclusion? Can you demonstrate it? And then you'd better have a really good demonstration for how you concluded that the number is even. If instead you say it's been divinely revealed to me that they're even, or I take it on faith that the number is even, or somebody else told me that the number is even, or I looked at it and it just didn't seem like it could really be, it made no sense to me that the number could be odd, and therefore I concluded it's even, all of those are really bad reasons. But at no point in this discussion did I say to you, I think the number of gumballs is odd, because that is a claim that also carries a burden of proof. So the fact that there are only two answers, even or odd, does not mean that if I disagree with you on whether or not it's justified to believe that the number is even, then I am therefore claiming that it's odd. The same thing can be done with the number of blades of grass and the number of hairs on someone's head, or whether they're even or odd. I prefer the courtroom analogy, which is basically you are innocent until proven guilty. And so for the question of a God, either a God exists or it doesn't. If you come to me and you say that the God exists, which is you saying the number of gumballs is even, I'm going to ask you the how and why. And you're either going to give sufficient evidence to conclude that a God exists, or I'm going to continue with my default that he doesn't. This is where the gumball analogy breaks down, because we don't have a default of odd. We don't have a default of even. However, in the courtroom analogy, we do have a default, which is you are presumed innocent, not actually innocent, but presumed innocent until demonstrated to be guilty. So God is being accused of existing, and I am granting God innocence of existing until somebody demonstrates that he actually is guilty. So the gumball analogy works for the people who are like, well, I told you there was a God, and you're saying, no, there isn't. That's the even or odd.
Right.
The courtroom analogy is more about I'm not convinced. And the bubblegum analogy works because we know that just because something has two answers doesn't mean that if you assert one, that we have any reason to believe that yours is right, and that me not accepting your assertion is not me also accepting the opposite.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I mean, two separate assertions. We don't want to create a false antithesis. That's what I've been saying for years. Let me see, Matt. I know we're a little over an hour. I just got a few questions left. I hope that's okay.
Sure, I'll try to give shorter answers.
Hey, I'm on your time, my friend. So I'm curious. Has there ever been a especially compelling argument for the theistic worldview that you can think of?
No.
No?
I get asked all the time, and everybody's surprised that I can give a quick no. Don't get me wrong. I understand why some arguments are appealing to people.
Fine-tuning?
I understand fine-tuning. I understand why that is. I understand why first cause arguments are like that. I understand about the people who are like, well, it just seems like it's either God or random chance. And I keep pushing back against that, saying, no, we're not in any way suggesting that the universe operates based on random chance. If anything, it's the exact opposite of that. That occasional randomness is filtered through a rigid structure of normality and non-randomness. It is like having one of those ball sorters where you have several different tiers with different sized holes in them. And you dump all your rocks in there and you shake them through. And of course, the smaller rocks make it all the way down to the bottom because the holes are graduated, and the larger rocks stop up there. Now, the actual movement of the rocks could be viewed as random. It's not. When we're shaking that around, we are injecting forces. It is beyond our ability to calculate what each one of those rocks is going to do and how it's going to move in order to make a prediction for all of those rocks. But we can still make predictions about what will happen to the whole, to the system. And that is the rocks will, generally speaking, filter themselves by size in that contraption. So the fact that there's randomness is, it may not even be that there's randomness. It may not be that there's any randomness in the universe. They just may be patterns that we can't assess and figure out. But the universe, to whatever extent there is randomness, is order acting on randomness. And when it comes to evolution, it is random mutations that are acted upon by natural selection. And the selection pressures that determine which genes are passed on are anything but random.
Wow. Yeah, interesting. You made me think of, I'm guessing you're familiar with Stephen Jay Gould, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. His book, The Borgias Sail, where he talks about a mountain that sheared off. So you could see sort of the trees and the bushes and the roots and where they stopped and where they came out. And his hypothesis is that if you were to rewind that process and were to do it again, the process would have completely changed. The bushes, the trees, and that would have come out completely differently. So picking you up on the point about randomness.
Yeah, it's an interesting hypothesis. Unfortunately, it's one we can't test.
Right.
Whether or not we are in a perfectly deterministic universe, it seems we are not, and yet the universe seems largely determinate. And so it's like, if we rewound the universe back to time zero, would you and I be sitting here having this exact same conversation? And I have to conclude that it's at least likely that we would, because I'm not convinced that there is any actual randomness, that the randomness we perceive as noise in the system may also be deterministic. And it's just, like patterns that we can't see. Mm-hmm. And the person who thinks that if we rewound, things could go differently, which is what they're trying to do when they talk about free will, the notion that I could have done otherwise. Even if you were to show that things could have worked out differently through randomness, that still doesn't mean that randomness rises to the level of becoming what they want to call free will. And so, that version of free will, I wholeheartedly reject, the libertarian notion.
Interesting. No, thanks, Matt. Now, obviously, you've been... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, when you mentioned Gould, I thought you were going to go to non-overlapping magisteria.
Oh, yeah, NOMA. That's what they all do, though. That's boring, right? So, Matt, obviously, you've been interviewed, many times over the years. I'm curious, has there ever been a question that hasn't been asked of you that you wish someone would ask?
I don't think so. I mean, there probably are questions that I wish someone would ask. It's just I don't know what they are. I'm not... I do things. I appreciate people taking an interest in what I do. I'm happy to sit down and talk about what I think with people. I'm not as interested in me to where it's like, why wouldn't anybody ever ask me this question? Like, what? And it's because the questions that they would ask me that might fit that would be questions about me. And I'm not interested in questions about me. I know me. I'm interested in questions about what people believe and why, or what is the best explanation for this, or where are we likely to be? Although that question is frustrating too, when people are like, where do you see us in 20 years? I don't know. I sat on stage with Richard Dawkins in October of 2016, a couple of weeks before the election in Canada, and told all my Canadian friends who were terrified that Donald Trump would win that there was no way he was going to win. Clearly, I'm not very good at making predictions like that.
Right.
I actually think that he stands a really good chance of winning again, despite the fact that we have had, as of today, today's the 17th of October, 22 or 23 million early voters. That is 10 times more early voters by this time than we had in 2016. And because we know that the leftist Democratic wing are the ones who are most likely to vote early, if we were to stop polling tomorrow, I would bet everything I have that Biden would be president of the United States. However, we don't stop polling until, November 3rd.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. My new show, The Hang Up, I've been more focused on political issues. We've only done like 4 or 5 episodes. It's every Wednesday night. But because it's not part of the ACA, I'm not under any restrictions from the nonprofit. And so I can say whatever I want, and I do. And so we focus quite a bit. I've had Andrew Seidel on for 2 weeks. I'm going to have him on more. I'd love to have him on every week. We've talked about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat and Amy Coney Barrett. We were on the forefront before the news stations were even talking about Amy Coney Barrett. Andrew and I had pretty much focused on her almost exclusively, that she's going to be the one that they picked, and we nailed it. So on that front, being able to predict who the right is going to try to put on the Supreme Court, I get an A there.
Yes. Well, no, and you may have actually answered my next question, Matt, which is what you're up to these days, what our viewers can look forward to.
I still host the Atheist Experience every Sunday at 4:30. Almost every Sunday. There are other people on the show as well, and I'm gonna, I have I've started a new relationship with a woman in Florida, so that means that there's going to be some travel involved. She will come up here, and I'll go down there. But it also means that I might be taking a couple weeks off of the show from time to time. So I have the Atheist Experience on Sunday, every Sunday, and I have the Hang Up on Wednesdays on YouTube. Both are call-in shows. The Hang Up is more broad-based, but I still talk about religion and still interact with theists there. And because of the Backstreet Boys reunion tour, which is what we've been told we're supposed to refer to the pandemic on YouTube by that name so that we don't get demonetized.
That's funny.
Because of the Backstreet Boys reunion tour, I've been sheltering at home, and all of my external gigs are canceled. Literally tomorrow morning, I'm doing a lecture via Zoom meeting, kind of like this, with the Fellowship of Free Thought in Dallas, Texas. And so I'm going to be doing a couple of magic tricks and giving a lecture here at the camp, which means I have to scoot way back, move this table that's over here, up here in front of me, and then zoom my camera out so they can actually, see what's going on. But I'm doing most things from home. I saving a lot on gas. For all the people who tried to complain because I have a truck. Oh, you're killing the planet. I have a wood shop in my garage. I need a truck. I have magic props. I need a truck. But my truck has moved, I don't know, 50 miles in 20 weeks probably. It's I'm mostly staying home doing interviews like this. I game a lot on Twitch and interact with people there. Between now and the election, though, Jimmy Snow, who runs the Line Network where my Hang Up show is, Jimmy and I are planning on being live a lot up through election day, including like some 8-hour streams. And so it's not hard to find me. It's probably hard. Most people would be sick of me if I told them all the things I was doing.
No, thanks, man. I appreciate that. 2 questions left, sir, and then you're no longer my prisoner. How's that sound?
Perfect.
I'm curious, if you weren't a speaker, commentator, writer, what do you think you'd be in life, Matt?
Well, up until 5 or 6 years ago, I was software QA lead. And so I worked in tech for a number of years I did hardware testing for a while. I did software testing for a while. I did software QA lead for a while. If I got to pick my dream job that wasn't this, which this is in fact my dream job. I'm actually doing both of my dream jobs. I am an activist and a magician. If I couldn't do either one of those, I would probably be a constitutional lawyer.
Oh, cool. Awesome. All right. Matt Dillahunty, how can people find out about you, sir?
I don't know, just Google and try to spell my name right. It's my finding me on the different sides is often difficult. So it's like twitch.tv/Matt Dillahunty, but on YouTube it's Sans Deity, and I don't know. There's a page on me on Wikipedia. It might have some links there, but by and large, you can just Google Atheist Matt, and I'm pretty sure the rest of it will fill in with my name. On YouTube, the Atheist Debates Patreon project. So you can go to patreon.com/Atheist Debates. That's how I make most of my living. So if you're the type of person who wants to support the efforts, where I post my debates there, I post reviews of those debates, I post videos about various arguments. I'm getting ready in next week to do 2 different videos on epistemology, because the debate that I had on epistemology turned out to not really address that. So I have all of that work done. I'm doing a debate next Friday, so there'll be some debate prep for that. It's the Atheist Debates Project, Twitch, the Atheist Community of Austin, Atheist Experience TV show, and the Hang Up. It's all there. I don't have handy. I should have, like, once upon a time I had mattdillahunty.com and all of that went there, but I've got a dispute with the person who previously ran it. So for now, it's just Google me.
Excellent. Voila. Matt Dillahunty, that's all I have for you, sir.
All right. Thanks, John.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. I really appreciate you taking the time, and we'll get this published and get it up, and I'll be sure to send you a link as well, okay?
Absolutely. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. You take care.
You too.